Hello, you're very welcome to our course on Project 2013 Advanced. My name is Toby and I'm your instructor on this course. Before we actually get started, I need to talk to you about one or two assumptions that I'm going to make about what you have and about what you know. So I'll start with those. So let's start with what you have. I'm going to assume that you have a device with Project 2013 installed. I'm going to be running this course on Project Professional. If you have Project Standard, then there are one or two things that you won't be able to do. Not too many, but almost everything we're going to cover on this course you can do in Standard or Professional. I'm also going to assume that you're primarily using a mouse and keyboard for this course. Now, if you've done our basic course or you've been using Project on a touch device, you'll know that Project 2013 goes pretty well with a touch device. You can do virtually all the things with a touch device that you can do with mouse and keyboard. I could, of course, on this course demonstrate both, but it will get a bit tedious to do everything twice, so I'm going to use Project 2013 in the way that most people use it, which is with a mouse and keyboard. Having said that, one or two occasions in the course, if I think that there's a particular point that's relevant to people using a touch device, then I will make that when we get to that point in the course. However, if you are using a touch device, I'm going to assume, for example, that you know how to put Project 2013 into touch mode, and that the fact that I'm using mouse mode most of the time, which means that I'll see more in the ribbon at any one time, for example, won't particularly confuse or worry you, and that you'll be used to the fact that if you're using touch mode, you have to slightly adapt how you do things. The next thing I'm going to assume is that you have access to the example files that go with this project. There will be around about a dozen to 15 or 16 of them by the time we finished on the course. The names will look something like this. The number may be slightly different, the names may be slightly different, but you should know where that folder full of files is because I'm going to be referring to them on a fairly regular basis. And just incidentally, and while we're on the subject, I have another folder altogether which has got what I refer to as my scratch files in it. That's the odd files that I'll use to demonstrate things from time to time. These are files that are not provided as part of the course and are ones that I basically use on a temporary basis and then delete again. So from time to time you'll see me mention those. They will all have names that look quite different from these. So they'll have names like test or demo or something like that in them. Now let's talk about some of the things that I'm going to assume you know. I'm going to assume that you have the equivalent of the knowledge you would have got by successfully completing our Microsoft Project 2013 training. Now, if you're not sure what's in that, if you've actually learned Project 2013 in a different way, or maybe if you've used an older version of Project 2010, Project 2007, and you think that on the basis of using those earlier versions you can leap straight into the advanced training on Project 2013, just take the time to have a look through the content of our Project 2013 training course and make sure that you pretty much know everything in there, because there isn't really time on this advanced course to go through all of those things again. One or two of the topics, when we come to them, I will revise a couple of basics just to make sure that everything's clear regarding terminology. But I won't be doing material that's on that basic to intermediate course in any kind of detail again. So when it comes to any of these subjects, I'm going to pretty much assume that not only do you know them quite well, but that with the majority of them you've actually used them a few times yourself, so you're quite comfortable using them. If you've got any doubts about any of those subjects, I suggest you go through and make sure that you understand the topics before you start on the advanced course, because one thing I really don't want you to do is to start on the advanced course, get a bit lost early on, and then start saying to yourself, well, I wish I'd done the basic to intermediate one now. So make sure that you're comfortable with all the topics in the basic to intermediate course before you really get stuck into the advanced one. So let's now talk about earlier versions of Project. You may be an absolute expert in Project 2002 or Project 2003 or even Project 98 or one of those lovely old versions of Project. But even if you are, I suggest that things have just changed too much since then in the more recent versions to assume that you can leap in and start on Project 2013 with the advanced course. You need to get to grips with all of the changes that have happened since those earlier versions, and in particular things like the use of the ribbon interface. Now, if your experience is in Project 2007, you still have the fundamental issue that Project 2007, unlike most of the other components of Office 2007, didn't actually use the ribbon interface. So, although functionally it is closer to the functionality of Project 2013, you still have a very different interface in that you're still using the old menu system. So I would suggest that if you've used Project 2007, at least you need to get up to speed using the ribbon interface before you try to follow this Project 2013 advanced course. Even if you only do the early sections in the basic to intermediate course, just so that you can get used to using the ribbon, I think that's still a very useful thing to do, because it can be quite disorientating trying to cover some fairly complex topics when you're still getting used to using the ribbon interface. So if you've used Project 2007, even if you're a pretty strong user, make sure you're going to be comfortable with the ribbon interface before you follow the rest of this Project 2013 advanced course. Now, if your experience is in Microsoft Project 2010, then there really shouldn't be a problem. 2010 was the version of Project where the ribbon interface was actually introduced. It hasn't greatly changed in 2013. It's got the same adaptation as they all have to cope with touch devices, and there have been a couple of bits of rearrangement of it, but fundamentally it works in the same way. You will notice things like major changes in reports from Project 2010 to Project 2013, but to some extent we're going to be covering that on this course anyway. So if you're a very strong Project 2010 user, you should really have not much trouble getting straight into Project 2013 Advanced. Having said that, if you need a bit of a brush up on your skills, and bear in mind that in normal use most people tend to only use some parts of a product like Project 2010, maybe some parts you might be rusty of, there may be parts of it that you've never actually used. So it might still be worth spending a little bit of time going through the beginner to intermediate course to make sure that you have the breadth of knowledge that you need. But as I say, if you're a strong user, you shouldn't really have any great trouble getting to grips with Project 2013 Advanced. One other thing just to point out before we start is that I'm going to be using the US locale for most of this course, so I'm going to be using English United States spellings, and I'm going to be using US dollars as the currency units in most cases. There isn't really any reason why you should not use your local locale, so your own currency, your own format for dates and times and so on. When we come to one or two of the examples where you're actually taking an example that's provided with the course and producing an answer, by all means stick with your own units, because they're the ones that you should be working with, they're the ones you should be used to. As somebody who also manages projects apart from teaching other people how to use Project, I do a lot of work for companies in other countries, and I'm used to switching between currencies, languages and so on, and I think it's a very useful skill to be able to have. So don't just switch yourself into the US locale if you don't normally work in the US locale. Try to persevere with your own, and when there are any difficulties, just experiment with getting around those difficulties, because you'll find that that's very useful practice in itself. And the very last thing I'd like to say is that throughout this course we're not going to be using Project Server. I will mention it very briefly at the end of the course, but basically we're talking about Project 2013 on the desktop. Hopefully you'll have a professional version, but as I said earlier, even if you've only got Project 2013 standard, you should be fine on almost all of this course. So that's it. We're ready to get started. That's the end of this section. I'll see you in the next one.